Well, here we go. Welcome to episode 1 of Virtual Boy Works. Yes, that's right, I've launched another work series focusing on the chronology of a Nintendo platform. The difference here is that I actually have a solid shot of finishing this one within my lifetime. In fact, I'm aiming for about 6 months. The Virtual Boy was Nintendo's least successful platform ever, with a global install base that never even hit 1 million units. The company and its licensees only produced 22 officially released games for the platform, and over the first half of 2019, I intend to tackle them all. Virtual Boy has a terrible reputation, but that mostly has to do with the hardware, I think. My intention with Virtual Boy Works is to explore the console's entire library and give its software a fair shake. Do people bag on Virtual Boy games because they're bad games, or because they're games on a bad system? My hunch is the latter, and while I don't think there's any salvation for the Virtual Boy itself in store for this series, I have a feeling the games will probably fare better. Before we begin, I'd like to say just a few words on the behind-the-scenes stuff. The footage in this series, when possible, will be recorded from original Virtual Boy hardware that's been modded with a video out connector. The nature of this mod, which was created and sold by Furtek and installed by Jacob Proctor, means you won't be seeing game footage here in 3D. The system generates 2 simultaneous stereo images to create its 3D view, but the mod only outputs the left eye image. I've also used a grayscale color palette for these videos, reminiscent of the Game Boy, rather than going with a red-tinted palette that resembles the image seen on the console itself. While I'd prefer to go with the red for authenticity, YouTube's compression algorithm destroys red and black graphics, and would make this series look completely terrible. Ultimately, I've decided to go with the option that makes for better video quality, rather than to go after nostalgic warm fuzzies. But hey, when the footage here is used for the eventual Virtual Boy Works book, I'll be sure to throw a red overlay on top of the screenshots. Virtual Boy Works will explore the entire Virtual Boy library worldwide, all 22 games, but I'm taking a slightly different approach here than usual. We'll be looking at the US game chronology first, and then tackling the 8 Japan-only releases as a sort of postscript. Finally, special thanks to Chris Kohler of Kotaku, who has lent me his complete Virtual Boy library for this project, and who will be collaborating with me on the book version. Be sure to support his work and follow him on Twitter at Kobunheat. Virtual Boy was Nintendo's 4th console, chronologically speaking, and every one of these systems was unified by the presence of 2 constants. First, there was tennis. Tennis showed up at the NES's US launch. If you really want to go deep, a version of that tennis game had been the first Versus Unisystem release in arcades a year and a half before that as well. In 1989, tennis showed up on Game Boy, and finally, Super Tennis arrived a couple of months after the Super NES's 1991 release, too. The second Nintendo console constant, of course, were the Mario games that always came in tow. Donkey Kong on Famicom, Super Mario Bros. On NES, Super Mario Land on Game Boy, and Super Mario World on Super NES. Tennis and Mario, the 2 reliable tentpoles of a new Nintendo console. Unsurprisingly then, Nintendo decided to combine the 2 for Virtual Boy's launch. Not only is the console's American pack-in title an adaptation of tennis, it's also a Mario game. It's Mario's Tennis. Mario's Tennis may not seem remarkable in the here and now, where more than half a dozen of these things exist, but it was a bit more fresh in 1995. This Virtual Boy release marked the first time the Mario gang had appeared in a tennis title as a Super Mario Kart-style selectable character pantheon. Mario was no stranger to sports by this point in his career, of course. He had served as line judge on the NES and Game Boy tennises, and refereed in Punch-Out! Even so, prior to Mario's Tennis, he had only gotten his white-gloved hands dirty in the gentleman's sports of golf and racing. Here, for the first time, he hits the court with 6 friends and rivals for both singles and doubles matches. Nintendo really seemed to like the results. In addition to shipping this as the pack-in title for the American Virtual Boy, Mario's Tennis kicked off a franchise of Mario-centric tennis titles that continues to this day. Mario's Tennis made perfect sense as a pack-in. Besides featuring the company's best-selling mascot character, it also presented players with a concise mission statement for the Virtual Boy itself. After all, tennis is arguably the single oldest video game genre, depending on how you parse the medium and its history. Physicist William Higginbotham created Tennis for Two way back in 1958, a game that ran on an oscilloscope and more or less proved that, yes, people can control video signals for the sake of entertainment. A decade and a half later, Pong would become the world's first commercial video game hit, a primitive adaptation of table tennis that dominated gaming throughout much of the 70s. Even Nintendo got its start in video gaming by selling standalone home Pong clones. As such, it serves as a sort of calibration exercise for each new system that comes along. How does this gaming platform compare to what's come before? What's special about it? A console's first take on the most venerable gaming genre speaks volumes. And here we have tennis on Virtual Boy. And the whole thing absolutely plays up the central hook of this daring little mess of a system. Thanks to the console's power and 3D visualization feature, Mario's Tennis finally allows Nintendo's designers to realize a dream they had been pursuing since the original NES Tennis: a down-in-the-action, court-height visual perspective. Unlike most early tennis games, which used a side-on perspective, Nintendo always presented their courts with a skewed point of view that made the forecourt larger than the backcourt to create a sense of depth. But Mario's Tennis is the first time we've seen the camera drop down to put players into the thick of the action, with the active character front and center on the screen at all times. This puts it on roughly equal footing with contemporary PlayStation launch title 3D Power Serve Tennis. Of course, it lacks the polygonal graphics of that game, but the point still comes across. The perspective here allows players to run far enough forward and laterally to cause entire portions of the court to shift out of view, making for, by far, the smoothest and most immersive tennis game we've seen on a Nintendo system to this point. The court movement is a lot more convincing than some Super NES Mode 7 effect would be. It helps that the Virtual Boy's self-contained screens allowed the system to enjoy a widescreen resolution unique among game systems at the time. Its aspect ratio is about 40% wider than standard television-based consoles of the era, which gives you more lateral visual information here and allows the action to zoom in close to the characters, without losing important visual details surrounding the characters. It also helps that despite boasting graphics that look like blood-soaked Game Boy visuals, Virtual Boy was a considerably more powerful system than that console or even the Super NES. Running on a 32-bit RISC chip, Virtual Boy could display 2 simultaneous widescreen stereo images. And because that processor was mostly pushing monochrome bitmap sprites rather than polygons, it could do a lot with those humble elements. Just look at the character sprites here, they're huge and detailed. These are some of the best sprites anyone had ever seen on a Nintendo system to this point, and they move freely around a tennis court that scales and skews fluidly in all directions. And of course the fact that you can run into and out of the court while hitting a ball that moves into and out of the screen, as other characters scale up and down based on your distance from them, neatly showcases not only the Virtual Boy's hardware power, but also its 3D effects. There's a genuinely convincing sense of immersion here as you run around the court, and the ball volleys back and forth over the net, all enhanced by the excellent sprite work. In fact, this game is much harder to play without the 3D effect. Seen here in this video, the ball always appears a little larger than seems natural, and its location along the Z-axis is hard to judge. But when viewed on the Virtual Boy itself with Stereo 3D, the illusion works perfectly. The whizzy visuals go a long way toward making up for the fact that, as a tennis game, Mario's Tennis actually feels pretty flat. Well, figuratively flat. For starters, it represents a pretty significant step backward from Game Boy Tennis and Super Tennis in that it only supports play for a single person. Yes, Virtual Boy is physically designed to be used by a single person to the exclusion of all else, but the system included a port for a link cable. That link cable was sadly never released, and even if it had been, Mario's Tennis was still only designed to be played solo. If you select doubles mode, you simply get to play with 3 other AI-controlled participants. Dogged Nintendo fans have both created their own ersatz link cables and patched a number of games to include multiplayer, including this one, but out of the box, Mario's Tennis immediately took players back in time more than a decade to the single-player mundanity of NES Tennis. Multiplayer support was a huge selling point for the Game Boy version in particular, so already you can see an example of the unfortunate choices that haunted Virtual Boy for its brief lifetime. As we've seen with single-player sports games over the course of the work series, the experience here is regulated entirely by the quality of the artificial intelligence. And in this case, On the easy difficulty, you can basically cheese the entire game by drawing your opponent to the left side of the screen and then slicing right. Meanwhile, on normal and hard difficulty, you can basically roll over and die. There's not really much in between. There are some other fine differences between difficulty levels. For example, characters' bodies can obscure the ball on screen on hard, but for the most part, hard simply means the AI is way more aggressive, rarely misses the ball, and is a lot stricter about your own timing and commands. Mario's Tennis may make use of Virtual Boy's fancy graphical capabilities, but it does little to take advantage of the system's weird and complicated controller, which contains 2 face buttons, 2 shoulder buttons, and 2 D-pads. Everything you can do here is executed on one D-pad, and the 2 face buttons. There are no dives or dashes with the shoulder buttons or anything along those lines. There are also no special moves or power smashes available as there would be in future Mario Tennis titles. As such, the only differentiators between characters are their stats: speed, racket size, and strength. The 7 characters here seem to have carried over their general traits from Super Mario Kart. Mario is the boring all-rounder, Yoshi is crazy fast but clumsy with his racket, and Donkey Kong Jr. is slow but powerful. As an aside, it's interesting that DK Jr. represents the Kong family here, since Mario's Tennis arrived a full year after Donkey Kong Country wiped and rewrote the whole Kong family tree. It's hard to know if that means Nintendo hadn't fully committed to the new Kong canon, or if Mario's Tennis had just been in the works long enough that his character sprite work predates Donkey Kong Country. In any case, the 7 characters are mostly what you'd expect. Mario, Luigi, Princess Toadstool, not yet Peach in the English versions, Toad, Yoshi, Donkey Kong Jr., and a lone Koopa Troopa. Bowser is conspicuous by his absence. Presumably, he was too busy planning his upcoming Super Mario 64 schemes to be able to participate in this game. Whatever the case, the characters all look great here. They've been animated with huge, lively sprites. They each have their own expressive reactions to the outcome of the game, from the princess's grin of delight at winning to Luigi's hang-dong expression when he whiffs a play. The Virtual Boy was notorious for causing headaches during extended play sessions, but the design of Mario's Tennis doesn't really reflect the helicopter mom approach Nintendo adopted to minimize playtime. A quick game with options set for a speedy match takes a good 15 minutes, and a full format match could take as much as an hour. Not really the ideal for those who aren't fans of eye strain. Meanwhile, the tournament mode, in which you work your way through a tree of competitors to jockey for the top slot, could theoretically take even longer than that, though it's weirdly unforgiving. If you lose a match, there's no continue or retry option. It's simply game over. So on the whole, Mario Tennis really kind of feels like the Virtual Boy experience in a nutshell. It's visually a delight, with effective use of 3D depth and boasting some attractive graphics. But in terms of actual gameplay, it feels anemic and poorly considered. It lacks features present in the primitive Tennis for Game Boy, including the crucial multiplayer options that make sports games worth playing in the first place. There's no denying it looks great though, and it set the stage for some genuinely great Mario-themed sports titles that would appear in the years ahead. So while it's perhaps not an essential work, it's an interesting one all the same. Next time on Virtual Boy Works, another NES standard gets the red and black treatment.